I'm going to preach a lesson this morning that's a little bit different than anything that I can ever remember doing. I'm going to talk about what we can learn from 2 days in the life of David. Now, this is going to require a good deal of reading, and so I'm going to go pretty quickly and offer very few illustrations. But I do want to look a little at David before we continue on. David was the second king of the United Kingdom. When the people demanded a king, God gave them Saul. Saul was selected simply because he was an attractive, tall, strong warrior. And when you look at David, after Saul was rejected because he was not a spiritually minded person and willing to submit himself to the will of God, David was selected for other reasons. In chapter 16 of the book of 1 Samuel, the Lord said unto Samuel, How long wilt thou mourn for Saul, seeing I have rejected him from reigning over Israel? Fill thine horn with oil, and go. I will send thee to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided me a king among his sons. Skipping down to verse 10 and 13, 10 through 13, again Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. And Samuel said unto Jesse, The Lord hath not chosen these. And Samuel said unto Jesse, Are here all thy children? And he said, There remaineth yet the youngest, and behold, he keepeth the sheep. And Samuel said unto Jesse, Send and fetch him, for we will not sit down till he come hither. And he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy, and with all of a beautiful countenance, and goodly to look to. And the Lord said, Arise, and anoint him, this is he. Then Samuel took the horn of oil, and anointed him in the midst of his brethren, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. So Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. He was selected to be king, we must remember, when he was about 17 years old. He did not become king until he was 30. So we had a 13-year period of preparation, if you please. He is referred to in the book of Acts chapter 13, verse 22, as being a man that had a special place, if you please, in the mind of God. Much like Job, there's none like him in all the earth. It is said concerning David in verse 22, And when he had removed him, talking about Saul, he raised up unto him David to be king, to whom also he gave testimony and said, I have found David, the son of Jesse, a man after mine own heart, which shall fulfill all my will. That was the reason, of course, that David was selected. He is mentioned 953 times in the Old Testament. If you want to know how important a character David was in the Old Testament dispensation, 953 times. He is mentioned 58 times in the New Testament, even though, of course, he is not living and had not lived for hundreds of years before the New Testament came into existence. But he's mentioned 58 times in the New Testament. He is said to have been a model king. In fact, in the Old Testament, there is a word that's used concerning him, or a phrase that's used concerning him. I want to look at the last time the phrase was used. This is the last king who earned this honor. In verse 2, that would be Josiah. He did that which was right in the sight of the Lord, and walked in all the way of David his father, and turned not aside to the right hand or to the left. And I believe that he is the only king of which that is said, that he did not turn aside to the right hand or the left. The others are said to walk in the ways of David, but they didn't take away their high places or whatever. But Josiah is given the most credit of any. But David is held up to be the model by which they all were judged. He is, in fact, a direct ancestor of Jesus Christ. Jesus was a descendant of David. And when you look back to the genealogy in both Matthew and Mark, but we'll look at Matthew's account. If you look at Matthew's account in verse 1, that's really a little unusual how David came to be. There's a man by the name of Solomon who had a son by the name of Boaz. Boaz then begat Obed of Ruth. And Obed begat Jesse. And Jesse begat begat David the king. And David the king begat Solomon. Now, when you look at that, it's unusual because, in fact, Ruth, of course, you know by reading the book of Ruth, actually came from Moab. She was not a Jew. She was, in fact, an idolater in the beginning and was a Jew by choice, choosing to go back to the land of Israel and settle there. And if you go read the book, it's a very interesting read as to how she became the wife of Boaz, and how Obed came to have her as his mother. But David was a direct ancestor of Jesus Christ. But I'm going to tell you something about David. Despite all this, despite the fact he's the second king, despite the fact he's a man after God's own heart, despite the fact he's mentioned over 1,000 times in the inspired word, he's referred to as a model king, he's a direct ancestor of Jesus, but when you mention the word David, there are 2 days in his life that you remember. 2 days. Now, these 2 days are totally different days. I mean, these days are so different that it gives new meaning to the word Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I mean, you're talking about 2 completely opposite things that happen. Sometimes you see in the news someone who commits an atrocious crime, and the mother or the grandmother says, well, you know, that's just not the son that I knew. Well, almost when you read these 2 days, that's kind of how you view it. It's like you wonder, how could these things be from the same person? But we can learn a lot from it. Now, I tell you, this is a long reading. I thought about it, and I thought about it. And I thought about just not reading it all and trying to skip through it. But the more I thought about it, I didn't think that I could do any justice to it at all if I did that. So I'm going to read as quickly as I can. And I don't normally do it, but I'm going to read 50 verses. And I'm not going to comment on them. I'm just going to read them because I want you to be refreshed and have this story that happened here with David and Goliath fresh in your mind, and then we'll go back and make comments concerning it. Now the Philistines gathered together their armies to battle, and were gathered together at Shukkok, which belongeth to Judah, and pitched between Shukkok and Azekah and Espadamian. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together and pitched by the valley of Elah, and set the battle in array against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on a mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, and there was a valley between them. And there came out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span, approximately 8 feet. He had a helmet of brass upon his head. He was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass. He had greaves of brass upon his legs, a target of brass between his shoulders. And the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and one bearing a shield went before him. And he stood and cried unto the armies of Israel, and said unto them, Why are you come out to set your battle in array? Am not I a Philistine, and your servants to Saul? Choose you a man for you, and let him come down to me. If he be able to fight with me and to kill me, then will we be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then shall ye be our servants and serve us. And the Philistines said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistines, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now David was the son of that Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse, who had 8 sons. And the man went among men for an old man in the days of Saul. And the 3 eldest sons of Jesse went and followed Saul to the battle. And the names of the 3 sons that went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, Abinadab, and the third, Shema. And David was the youngest, and the 3 eldest followed Saul. And David went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. And the Philistine drew near morning and evening and presented himself 40 days. And Jesse said unto David his son, Take now for thy brethren an ephah of this parched corn and these 10 loaves, and run to the camp of the brethren, and carry these 10 cheeses unto the captain of their 1,000, and look how thy brethren fare, and take their pledge. Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. And David rode up early in the morning and went and left the sheep with the keeper, and took and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the trench as the host was going forth to the fight, and shouted for the battle. For Israel and Philistines had put the battle in array, army against army. And David left his carriage in the hand of the keeper of the carriage, and ran into the army, and came and saluted his brethren. And as he talked with them, behold, there came out the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, and out of the armies of the Philistines, and spake according to the same words, and David heard them. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him, and were sore afraid. And the men of Israel said, Have ye seen this man that is come up? Surely to defy Israel is he come up, and it shall be that the man who killeth him, the king will enrich him with great riches, will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel. And David spake to the men that stood by him, saying, What shall be done to the man that killeth this Philistine, and taketh away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him after this manner, saying, So shall it be done to the man that killeth him. And Eliab, the eldest brother, heard when he spake unto the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David, and he said, Why camest thou down hither? And with whom hast thou left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know thy pride and the naughtiness of thine heart, for thou art come down that thou mightest see the battle. And David said, What have I done? Is there not a cause? And he turned from him toward another, and spake after the same manner, and the people answered him again after the former manner. And when the words were heard which David spake, they rehearsed them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, Let no man's heart fail because of him. Thy servant will go and fight against this Philistine. And Saul said to David, Thou art not able to go against the Philistine to fight with him, for thou art but a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. And David said unto Saul, Thy servant kept his father's sheep. There came a lion, a bear, and took a lamb out of the flock. And I went out after him and smote him, and delivered it out of his mouth. And when he arose against me, I caught him by his beard, and smote him, and slew him. Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he hath defied the armies of the living God. David said, moreover, The Lord hath delivered me out of the paw of the lion, out of the paw of the bear. He will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said unto David, Go, and the Lord be with thee. Saul armed David with his armor, and he put an helmet of brass upon his head, and also he armed him with a coat of mail. And David girded his sword upon his armor, and he essayed to go, for he had not proved it. And David said unto Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not proved them. And David put them off him. And he took his staff in his hand, and chose him 5 smooth stones out of the brook, and put them in a shepherd's bag, which he had, even in a scrip. And his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. And the Philistine came on, and drew near unto David. And the man that bare the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth and ruddy, and of a fair countenance. And the Philistine said unto David, Am I a dog that thou comest to me with staves? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, Come to me, and I will give thy flesh to the fowls of the air and to the beasts of the field. Then said David to the Philistine, Thou comest to me with a sword, and with a spear, and with a shield. But I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. This day will the Lord deliver thee into mine hand, and I will smite thee, and take thine head from thee, and I will give the carcasses of the host of the Philistines this day unto the fowls of the air, and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And all this assembly shall know that the Lord saveth not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. And it came to pass when the Philistine arose and came and drew nigh to meet David, that David hasted, ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag, and took thence a stone, and sling it, and smote the Philistine in his forehead, that the stone sunk into his forehead, and he fell upon his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone. He smote the Philistine and slew him, but there was no sword in the hand of David. Now, when you read that, you can't help but be impressed by it. There's not a young boy anywhere who's been to Bible class many times that hasn't heard the story and really appreciates it. An action-adventure story unlike any other. But there are lessons we can learn. And I want to kind of put a few of them out there to you. You know, one of the things that I think we learn from this is that many times we view things as they appear. And when we do that, we're misled. We may reach conclusions that are not conclusions that are warranted. The people of Israel looked upon a man that was 8 foot tall, had a huge sword, and a huge spear, and had a huge amount of armor upon him, and he was so impressive that he was intimidating. And the whole point of this was he was to come out every day and intimidate them, so they were afraid to do anything. Now, it never occurred to them that here's a man who, like any other, is vulnerable in some ways. I observed a fight one day in which there were 2 boys at the tennis court, and one of them pulled a knife on the other, and the other boy picked up a rock about that big around and said, "Come on, I'll just knock you in the head before you ever get to me." And he was right. And the man with the knife decided it was time to go. David was able to do something that these people believed was impossible because they just simply looked at it at a glance and said, this can't be done. I think a lot of times Christians are kind of the same way. We look at the world that we live in, and we think, how can anybody be faithful before God? How can we ever cause God's mission to survive in face of such odds? But we need to realize that we can't look at things in the way that human beings often do, just on the appearance, and not see what's underneath. When the Apostle Paul was in the city of Corinth, and he was preaching the gospel there, he became very distraught because there was so much opposition. And the Lord spoke to him in the night and said, be not afraid, but speak and hold not thy peace, for I am with thee, and no man shall set on thee to hurt thee, for I have much people in this city. Well, you know, after that, he continued there 1 year and 6 months teaching the Word of God, when he thought that the situation was so bleak that he would immediately have to retreat and move on to some other city as he often had done. I believe it's a lesson that everybody needs to learn. Don't just look at something and reach the conclusion that, hey, you can't solve this problem. It's impossible. Sometimes solutions to problems come from unlikely sources. Now here you have the armies of Israel there. All the men that in our modern day would be the hardened combat infantrymen, the special forces, all these people with special skills. And we're looking to them for solutions. And they say we can't provide them. And here walks up a boy 17 years old. And the expression Rudy, by the way, means probably that he doesn't have a beard and he still is not shaving. He's wet behind the ears, as we might say. And everybody made fun of him. And he walks up and he begins to say, you know what, this is a problem that can be solved. Well, Saul gives him his army to solve the problem, his armor to solve the problem. But he can't use the armor because it doesn't fit him. He's never used it. And so he has to make other choices in order that he might be able to overcome the Philistine. In chapter 21, when the Apostle Paul had been arrested, had been accosted by the people of Israel, and they're trying to kill him. And he is spared in chapter 21 of the book of Acts, verse 31. But you know who spares him? He is the chief captain of the band of the Roman army who came to his aid and who took him and removed him from imminent danger. Now, who would have thought that a few short period before, you have a Pontius Pilate who executes the Savior upon whom the religion is based that Paul is now preaching. And now all of a sudden, an officer in that same Roman army steps in to rescue Paul. Would you have thought that would have been possible? Probably not, but it happened. And I think it's one of those situations that we need to realize that sometimes we look for solutions to problems, and when they're actually solved, it's something that we would have never thought of, or we've never considered. We have to have, as we might say at times, simply a little more faith in God. We also need to realize this. When someone's suggesting that something can be done, oftentimes they're belittled. You know, when Jesus was here in Luke 8, verse 53, and he knows that he has the capability of raising this young girl from the dead, and he's about to do that. And when he makes a statement to that effect, that what you find these people doing is they laughed him to scorn. They just thought, oh yeah, you know, you're crazy. Some carpenter from up there in Nazareth, and you're telling us that you're going, well, it's never going to happen. Have you ever seen it happen? You ever seen people today who say that they're going to do something and people laugh them to scorn? I was watching a movie the other night, and Pat was kind of impressed. It had Audie Murphy in it. She didn't know who he was. And I said, well, you know, he actually was. She said, boy, he looks young, and he looks like he's kind of a little guy. I said, you know, he won the Congressional Medal of Honor in World War II. He's a pretty famous guy, you know, in that particular regard. He later became an actor. And he doesn't look it. I mean, he looks like a little kid that's not capable of anything. Well, he's playing a part in this movie where he comes to town, he's solving a problem, he doesn't have a gun. And all the people are laughing at him. He suddenly picks up a gun, begins to shoot, and then makes it clear to them that actually, I don't carry one, but I know how to use one. Sometimes people make fun of things that they really don't consider. Just like those folks in that movie would make fun of a guy and say, he can't do anything. I've seen that in time past where people have challenged someone and it didn't work out very well. You have to be careful that when people say they can do things, sometimes the problem is not that it can't be done. The problem is we don't have the faith to accomplish it. And that was the problem here. Problem was, it wasn't a problem that couldn't be solved. It was a problem that they didn't have the faith to take the challenge before them. I read something in a story that interests me. I know that slinging a sling and a slingshot are not the same thing. I've tried to use a sling. And if you've ever tried it, I'm going to tell you, some of you probably been adventuresome enough to try it, but it is a difficult thing. A sling is actually just a little pouch, 2 thongs of leather attached to it. You sling it around. You have to learn to release one at the proper time so that it lets the projectile go where you want it to go. And I've never been able to do much with it. I did, however, become very proficient with a slingshot as a young boy. You sat on the carport, had a clothesline post that was about 30 or 40 feet from me, and I could sit on the carport and hit it almost every time. Clothesline post about 2.5-inch pipe. If I did one thing, used a marble. Now, if I picked a gravel up out of the yard, I ain't no way in the world I could hit a clothesline post because the projectile won't go straight. But if I used a marble, a lot of people don't notice what it said here. David wasn't a guy who didn't know what he was doing. He picked up, what out of the stream? 5 smooth stones. I suspect that means as circular as he possibly could find them so that they don't pick up the airwaves and cause them to go off in different directions and would actually hit the mark you wanted to hit. Something a lot of people don't realize? A lot of people read this story and they interpret this as a miraculous act, and that is not so. There is no miraculous act ever mentioned. You just read it again. There's no miraculous action in this passage at all. David just had enough confidence in God to sustain him. And he realized that, I've done this before. And I believe I can do it again. And the fact is that he overcame this problem simply because he had the faith to attempt it. When you go back to the book of Luke chapter 17, it's kind of interesting what this read says. This is another read sometimes that's been read to prove one point so much that we kind of reach the conclusion that's all it says, and it's really not. It's a passage that has some other things in it if we just kind of think about it a little bit. Normally, we read beginning in verse 6. Actually, in verse 7 is where we usually read about the servant, he just does what he's told, etc. and so forth. But I want you to read what began with verse 5. The apostle said unto the Lord, increase our faith. And here's what the Lord said. If you had faith as a grain of mustard seed, you might say unto this sycamore tree, be thou plucked up by the root, and be thou planted in the sea, and it should obey you. And then he asked a question. Which of you, having a servant plowing or feeding cattle, will say unto him by and by, when he has come in from the field, go and sit down to meat? In other words, are you going to serve him or are you going to serve you? And will not rather say unto him, make ready wherewith I may sup, and gird thyself and serve me, till I have eaten and drunken, and afterward thou shalt eat and drink? Doth he thank that servant because he had done the thing that I commanded him? I throw not. So likewise, when you shall have done all things which are commanded you, say, we're unprofitable servants, we have done that which is our duty to do. You know what he's really getting at? If God gives us a command and we say that we can't do it, our problem is our faith. How many times when you were a young child did your parents say to you, can't, never did anything? Just think about that. All these people say, we can't overcome Goliath. Can't, never did anything. There was no miracle involved in this. David did something that is very plausible. I'll tell you what. Had I been in a position with someone that needed to be knocked off with that slingshot in the backyard with a marble, I fully believe I could have hit him between the eyes too if I'd have wanted to. Wasn't a miracle. David just used the talents he had and he accomplished the purpose before him. But he did it because he had the faith to accomplish it. Sometimes we look at Christians today and the work that's before us, and the reason we don't accomplish the things that we are, maybe we say, well, I can't teach that person, they never believe me. Well, if that happens, you won't. I mean, you just think about it and you understand the principle that's involved. I need to go quickly. This was a seemingly impossible task done by a 17-year-old boy who was made fun of, and there was no miracle involved. Now, that's what you learn from this day in the life of David. But let's skip over to the life of another day in the life of David, and that's the sin with Bathsheba. In the 11th chapter of 2 Samuel, there are 25 verses here, and they won't take near as long to read as would 50, so we'll read them. It came to pass after the year was expired, at the time when kings go forth to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they destroyed the children of Ammon, besieged Rabbah. But David tarried still at Jerusalem. And it came to pass in the eventide that David arose from off his bed and walked upon the roof of the king's house, and from the roof he saw a woman washing herself, and the woman was very beautiful to look upon. And David sent and inquired after the woman, and one said, Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Elam, the wife of the Uriah the Hittite? And David sent messengers and took her, and she came in unto him, and he lay with her, for she was purified from her uncleanness, and she returned to her house. And the woman conceived, and sent and told David, Behold, I am with child. And David sent to Joab, saying, Send me Uriah the Hittite. And Joab sent Uriah to David. And when Uriah was coming to him, David demanded of him how Joab did, and how the people did, and how the war prospered. And David said to Uriah, Go down to thy house and wash thy feet. And Uriah departed out of the king's house, and there followed him a mess of meat from the king. But Uriah slept at the door of the king's house with all the servants of his lord, and went not down to his house. And when they had told David, saying, Uriah went not down unto his house, David came to Uriah, Comest thou not from thy journey? Why then dost thou not go down to thine house? And Uriah said unto him, The ark and the Israel and Judah abide in tents, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are encamped in the open field. Shall I then go into mine house to eat and to drink and to lie with my wife? As thou livest and as my soul liveth, I will not do this thing. And David said to Uriah, Tarry here today also, and tomorrow I will let thee depart. So Uriah abode in Jerusalem that day and the morrow. And when David had called him, he did eat and drink before him, and he made him drunk. And at even he went out to lie on his bed with the servants of his lord, but went not down to his house. And it came to pass in the morning that David wrote a letter to Joab, sent it by the hand of Uriah. And he wrote in the letter, saying, Set Uriah in the forefront of the hottest battle, and retire ye from him, that he may be smitten and die. And it came to pass, when Joab observed the city, that he assigned Uriah into a place where he knew that valiant men were. And the men of the city went out and fought with Joab, and there fell some of the people of the servants of David, and Uriah the Hittite died also. Then Joab sent and told David all the things concerning the war, and charged the messenger, saying, When thou hast made an end of telling the matters of the war unto the king, and if it be that the king's wrath arise, and he say unto thee, Wherefore approach ye so nigh to the city when you did fight? Know ye not what they would shoot from the wall? Who smote Abimelech, the son of Jerubbesheth? And did not a woman cast a piece of millstone upon him from the wall, repeating an act of history, that he died in Thebez? Why went ye nigh the wall? Then said thou, Thy servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. So the messenger went and came and showed David all that Joab had sent him. And the messenger said unto David, Surely the men prevailed against us, and came out into the field, and we were upon them, even to the entering of the gate, and the shooters shot from off the wall upon thy servants, and some of the king's servants be dead, and thy servant Uriah the Hittite is dead. Then David said unto the messenger, Thus shalt thou say unto Joab, Let not this thing displease thee, for the sword devoureth one as well as another. Make thy battle more strong against the city, and overthrow it, and encourage it. There's so many things to say here, I don't know that I could include them all in the 5 or 6 minutes that we have left. The one thing I want to tell you is this. This was a man after God's own heart. But don't you assume, whoever you are, that you cannot be tempted. You need to remember that it is very unlikely that this would have ever occurred in such a man as this, but it did. And you need to look at this and realize that this is a dark, dark, pitiful description of a man that should have known better. But you also understand that when you read in Luke chapter 4, in verse 1 and 2, that even Jesus, the Son of God, was led into the wilderness, and there he was tempted of the devil for 40 days. Now you need to remember that. You need to understand it. It's important that every one of us understand that there is the possibility that we can be tempted to do evil. If anyone would have told me that David, a man after God's own heart, would have committed adultery, caused a man to become drunk, murdered him, and then later took a nonchalant attitude, well, this one person dies as well as another, I would have not believed it. But it happened. And we need to realize how strong temptation can in fact be, and it's a great lesson that we learn from it. We also need to realize this. The only way to overcome temptation is to view it as a real and present danger. You know, if we don't view something as a real and present danger, and we're likely to get ourselves into trouble. Flee fornication, we're told in 1 Corinthians 6 and verse 18. Resist the devil and he'll flee from you, we're told in James 4 and verse 7. If we ignore the danger that Satan presents, then we may pay a tremendous price. I've seen in my lifetime people who ignore dangers. Perhaps the greatest one was the thing I saw not long ago where a guy down in Louisiana, I think it was last year or the year before, he and a bunch of his friends were drinking beer, and he wanted to make a big impression, so he runs out to the end of the pier and hollers curse words towards the alligators and jumps in the lake. And you know what they did? They killed him. Now, if you're crazy to think you can flirt with temptation, you're likely to end up in the same state. And one of the things that I think is important here, I hear people quite often say that David stayed back in Jerusalem. He should have been out in the battle. And sometimes you may question that, but you ought to read that very carefully. This was the time when kings went forth to battle, but the last words are, but David tarried at Jerusalem. If you take everything out of that verse, but those two statements, this was the time when kings went forth to battle, but David tarried still at Jerusalem. It really tells you something that's a tremendous, tremendous thing to consider and to realize. Also, we need to realize this. You know, when sin comes into play, if you look back, for example, to Peter, when Peter denied the Lord 3 times, you know what? He recognized that. He went out and wept, and later he becomes productive in the Lord's kingdom. On the other hand, Judas does pretty much the same thing. He goes and sells Jesus for the 30 pieces of silver. But he doesn't act in that way. You have to realize that Peter was a man of character who, like David, lost his way for a period of time and soon regained his balance. On the other hand, Judas was a person who was not so particular. In fact, it is stated specifically in John 12 and verse 6 that Judas was a thief. Now, that's written by inspiration, so I know that to be true. That means that he was governed by covetousness in his life. Well, what is it that led him to betray Jesus? 30 pieces of silver. Where did that come from? Are you surprised? A man who was a thief, whose life was governed by covetousness, you're surprised that he was able to commit sin for 30 pieces of silver? No, you're not particularly surprised. You need to realize that sin, if it's checked, I mean, even if you fall victim to temptation, if it's checked and we recognize it, we repent of it, we ask God's forgiveness, and we determine that we're going to do better, we can deal with that. Here, David commits adultery with Bathsheba, conceives a child, and had he simply called Uriah into his house and said, you know, I violated you, violated my confidence that you have in me, and I apologize. I don't know what Uriah's reaction would have been, but I know what God's would have been. He would have forgiven him. But he didn't do that. He went on to commit other sins to cover up the action that he had done. Now, I want to give you a summation. This was a seemingly impossible thing. Here is a guy that was 17 when he was chosen to be king. He doesn't become king until he's 30. That's some 13 years later. And now he's been king for quite a good deal of time, and he's learned to deal with things as a king. And you just expect better things out of him. This was a man that was loved and trusted by the people. You look at Uriah. Uriah wouldn't even leave the king's door. He was so committed to the king and to his cause that he would do nothing. Can you imagine that you've got a man that's so committed to you that he sleeps out on a hard porch instead of going home at night because of his commitment to you, and then you cause him to be killed? Now, you're talking about hard-hearted. Just consider it. Just consider what Satan can do, and consider what temptation will do, and consider what happens to sin if we don't check it. Seemingly impossible for a mature king who was loved and trusted the people to commit such a horrific deed. Those are 2 days in the life of David. Now, it's interesting to put them side by side. I mean, you learn a lot from this. You ought to. You learn a lot of things good, and you learn a lot of things bad from it. But I was trying to decide how I was going to summarize what we learned. And here's what I believe would be true. What do you learn from these 2 days in the life of David? Quoting the Apostle Paul. Now, I realize he wasn't talking about David. He was talking about other things that occurred in the Old Testament. I understand that. But he's talking about the Old Testament in kind of a general sense, though he was referring to a specific instance. He said, now all these things happened to them for examples, and they are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come. And then he says this, wherefore, let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. Every Christian better pay particular attention to that. I often say, this audience is filled with sinners. There are those who are still in sin, those who have been saved by the grace of God. But no one is deserving of the position that we occupy. We occupy that position before God because of His grace. And don't you think for a moment that Satan has given up on you. If you're a faithful child of God, Satan is doing everything he can, just like he was with David, trying to destroy you. And if you don't recognize that, you're going to have problems. So what do? You recognize this. No temptation taketh you, but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that you're able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape, that you may be able to bear it. One thing I want you to remember. Everything David did because David wanted to do it. When he served God faithfully, he did that because his will was to please God. And when he violated the will of God, he did that because his will was to do what he wanted to do. You're the one that makes the decision. Whatever your life looks like, whichever the days of David's life your life looks like, is going to be because of the decision that you make. You know, in the final analysis, God didn't make David kill Goliath. God didn't make David commit fornication with Bathsheba. Those were decisions David made. You need to consider it and you need to think about it. This is primarily a lesson for those who are children of God. Hopefully we profit from it. It's something I've thought about really quite a bit, tried to put it into words, and hopefully it's accomplished some good. I hope you never forget those 2 days in the life of David. There are great lessons to be learned there. Our time is gone from us and then some. I appreciate your attendance and your giving attention to the things I've got to say, especially with 75 verses of reading. But at any rate, if you need to be responsive to the gospel invitation, we certainly encourage you to do that by repenting and being baptized for remission of sins. And if you are, as a Christian, need to correct something in your life, it needs to be done in a public manner, we encourage you to do that. But it may be that there's something that needs correction that's not a public sin. I would ask that you pay attention to that. Ask God's forgiveness and for His redirection as together we stand and ask we thank.